The attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th was clearly a wake-up call for America with respect to the state of American democracy. But as a brain science researcher, though, I observed something else that day. I saw the violent eruption of repressed trauma, which has been festering in America's collective national psyche. It got me thinking, if we were to scan America's brain under what we call an fMRI machine, say at our Chapman University's Brain Institute, what would we observe? What would brain images reveal about America's state of mind? My guess is that we'd observe complex trauma and the impact of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, on American democracy. It got me more curious, asking, what can we apply from trauma research to heal America's traumatized brain and restore our nation's polarized politics and psyche? My path to researching the brain, specifically around mental health and trauma, began after the suicide of my mother. In dealing with my own pain and trauma in the aftermath of that profound loss, I now explore the convergence of three disciplines: brain science and behavior, narrative identity, and political psychology. America is experiencing complex PTSD, the culmination of traumatic events over the years, exhibiting as anger, grief, and loss due to COVID, economic uncertainty, political violence, and our history of racial and social injustice, to highlight just a few. Yet underlying these moments of America's reckoning, including what we witness today, is a more deeply repressed American trauma. It relates to the evolving debate over American identity. In other words, what does it mean to be American? Which Americans are more deserving of belonging, achieving the American dream, and fully participating in civic and political life? George Santayana said, "Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it." From the lens of brain and trauma, this translates as, what we cannot heal from our individual and ancestral histories, we are doomed to repeat. In my opinion, January 6th was no random act of violence or insurrection. It was the direct consequence of a nation that has failed to heal its repressed and enduring trauma. When we carry unhealed trauma, we subconsciously reenact it in our lives. Yet, by having the courage to face our nation's trauma, as Americans, we reveal not only America's failures and pain, but also our fortitude and perseverance. Let's now explore America's brain on trauma. Simply stated, PTSD is the lingering experience of a past threat. If our individual traumas are embedded and remembered somatically by our physical bodies, in the same way, America's traumas are imprinted and inherited societally in our nation's body politic. Trauma distorts our relationship with reality. As such, a traumatized brain is at risk of becoming polarized and radicalized. In the same way, a traumatized America is at risk of becoming polarized and radicalized. By applying current research into the neuropsychology of PTSD, I propose a new approach to healing America's trauma. Scans reveal the brains of those who have experienced abuse and trauma differ from healthy brains in both function and structure. One difference in particular is relevant to this talk. PTSD impairs the interhemispheric connectivity in the brain. What this means, PTSD weakens the connection and communication between the brain's right and left hemispheres. In the same way, America's PTSD drives the disconnect and discontent in America's right and left political parties. In order for a healthy brain to function, it requires the synchronization of both hemispheres operating in tandem. Likewise, a healthy American democracy requires the operational partnership between America's right and left political parties. Yet something's happened over the past few decades. America's political parties have shifted away from representing ideology to representing identity. These identities represent two conflicting visions of America which are fundamentally at odds with one another. A core component of our individual healing requires us to bring up our pain, our suffering, and trauma into conscious awareness. The same holds true for America's trauma. Today, we are at an inflection point. We cannot continue denying certain parts of America's past if we want to move forward into the future. America has to face its trauma in order to heal. In fact, there really is no other option. Today, we are witnessing resistance to this historical healing. For a traumatized brain, this resistance is a defense mechanism that manifests as avoidance and distorted recollection. As such, when we start having national conversations about America's painful past or topics such as racial trauma, it's natural for segments of society to react defensively. This impulse is to deny or even downplay the extent of American trauma and to reject the need for healing out of fear that the price is too devastating on the American psyche. The opposing view argues that by not healing America's trauma, American democracy itself is at risk of demise. So how does a traumatized America become a radicalized America? The media plays a large role reinforcing America's trauma. Think about it by the phrase, breaking news is breaking us apart. PTSD disrupts the brain's dopamine reward system, by which we require more dopamine hits to be stimulated. The media and cable news outlets expertly exploit this ability by employing a tactic known as amygdala hijacking. The amygdala is a tiny gland buried deep in our survival brain that governs our threat perception. Amygdala hijacking allows our brains to operate in a hyper-aroused state of anger, aggression, and anxiety. In this way, the media profits off of America's addiction to outrage. For them, dopamine equals dollars. The goal is no longer about solving problems. The goal now becomes keeping us scrolling and staying tuned. Furthermore, a traumatized brain scrambles our prefrontal cortex, making us more susceptible into believing fake news and conspiracy theories that can reaffirm our pre-existing political and social narratives. An impaired prefrontal cortex diminishes our capacity for critical thinking and holding opposing perspectives. A PTSD brain gravitates towards simplicity and the need for having an organized structure through which to make sense of a rapidly changing and confusing world. This makes it more difficult for us to categorize and interpret new information. Taken together, all of this PTSD puts us at risk of becoming detached from reality and in danger of becoming radicalized. Grief gives way to grievance. In times of heightened anxiety and unrest, we become susceptible to the politics of fear, which make us want to seek simple solutions to complex problems. In times of heightened unrest, we also become susceptible to a sensationalized view of the past, one which inevitably seems more idyllic than the current moment. While this restorative nostalgia for a better time may feel comforting, in actuality, it is an illusion that prevents us from healing. So what's the solution? Healing America's traumatized brain begins by meeting in the middle, by having conversations at the center. This means in real life, not at the fringes of our political parties or on social media. The right and left hemispheres of the brain are unified by the thin veneer of what we call the brain's corpus callosum. It consists of a network of nerve bundles that unify and link the brain's right-left hemispheres. In the same way, American democracy is held together by the thin veneer of our civil society and our democratic institutions. But PTSD creates inflammation in the brain, producing misfirings in the brain's corpus callosum. Likewise, our repressed American trauma incites inflammatory, divisive, and political rhetoric that further disrupts the communication between America's right and left political parties. Fortifying the corpus callosum happens by the concept of neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain's neurons to reconfigure and rewire into new networks. Neuroplasticity reveals how our actions and behaviors can literally restructure and re-strengthen the brain in positive ways. But here's the most amazing news. Every American represents a neuron in America's brain. Neuroplasticity in American democracy begins when we start connecting as Americans with each other. What this means, every American plays a vital role in healing America's trauma and fortifying our corpus callosum in America's brain. It aligns beautifully with the words we know from America's Declaration of Independence. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. I believe a strategy to get us towards this goal is what I call learning to re-Americanize. To re-Americanize entails creating a new 21st century civic and political infrastructure in America's brain. Infrastructure is more than just connecting America via bridges, tunnels, roads, or digital networks. We need today a new American infrastructure, connecting Americans in ways we would have never envisioned before. I believe this new American infrastructure will empower us to 1, restore faith in democracy, 2, re-envision our shared American identity, and 3, reclaim a culture of caring and a politics of belonging. So what does this look like in our daily lives? Well, first, it means learning to accept that our political disagreements are really just the creative tension to reinforce democracy. Let's stop being afraid of having conversations with those we disagree with politically. It also means investing in shared narratives and stories. Contrary to what we often hear, as Americans, there is far more that unites us than divides us. The narrative of division is largely stoked by the media and politicians who want us to dehumanize the other, making us to believe that the other side lacks basic human decency and values. Just think of the videos on CNN fixated on people throwing temper tantrums over mass mandates, or Fox News exclusively covering burning buildings during Black Lives Matter protests. In actuality, the stereotype of the rural, racist conservative and the urban elite liberal are largely mythology. But here's my hope. By learning to view our current national turmoil merely as a symptom of America's unhealed trauma, we now give permission for Americans across the political divide to let their partisan guard down even for just a little. and to participate in the re-Americanization process. By doing so, we begin to own not just who we are, but who we have been, who we are becoming, a nation of people who, while deeply flawed and often get it wrong, continue to press forward, striving in the face of adversity and setback toward the greater realization of America's promise. Liberty and justice, not just for some, but for all. This is what makes America exceptional. This is what it means to be American. Thank you.